Brought to you by WikiVidi documentaries. Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company was a publicly tradable corporation that was founded in 1602 and became defunct in 1799. It was originally established as a chartered company to trade with India and Indianized Southeast Asian countries, when the Dutch government granted it a 21-year monopoly on the Dutch spice trade. The VOC was an early multinational corporation in its modern sense. The VOC was the first company in history to issue bonds and shares of stock to the general public on an official stock exchange, making it the world's first listed public company. The VOC was influential in the rise of corporate-led globalization in the early modern period. With its pioneering institutional innovations and powerful roles in world history, the company is considered by many to be the first major modern global corporation, and was, at one stage, the most valuable corporation ever. In 1619 it forcibly established a central position in the Indonesian city of Jayakarta, changing the name to Batavia. Over the next 2 centuries the company acquired additional ports as trading bases and safeguarded their interests by taking over surrounding territory. To guarantee its supply it established positions in many countries, and became an early pioneer of outward foreign direct investment. In its foreign colonies the VOC possessed quasi-governmental powers, including the ability to wage war, imprison and execute convicts, negotiate treaties, strike its own coins, and establish colonies. With increasing importance of foreign posts, the company is often considered the world's first true transnational corporation. Along with the Dutch West India Company, the VOC became seen as the international arm of the Dutch Republic and the symbolic power of the Dutch Empire. To further its trade routes, the VOC funded exploratory voyages such as those led by Willem Janszoon, Henry Hudson, and Abel Tasman, who revealed largely unknown land masses to the Western world. In the golden age of Netherlandish cartography, VOC navigators and cartographers helped shape geographical knowledge of the modern world as we know them today. Socio-economic changes in Europe. The shift in power balance and less successful financial management resulted in a slow decline of the VOC between 1720 and 1799. After the financially disastrous Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, the company was first nationalized in 1796, and finally dissolved in 1799. All assets were taken over by the government, with VOC territories becoming Dutch government colonies. Company name, logo, and flag. In Dutch the name of the company is Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie or Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, abbreviated to VOC. The VOC monogram was possibly the first globally recognized corporate logo. The logo of the VOC consisted of a large capital V, with an O on the left and a C on the right leg. It appeared on various corporate items, such as cannon and coins. The first letter of the hometown of the chamber conducting the operation was placed on top. The adaptability, elegance, flexibility, simplicity, symbolism, and symmetry were considered notable characteristics of the VOC's well-designed monogram logo. Those ensured its success at a time when the concept of the corporate identity was virtually unknown. An Australian vintner has used the VOC logo since the late 20th century, having re-registered the company's name for the purpose. The flag of the company was red, white, and blue, with the company logo embroidered on it. Around the world and especially in English-speaking countries, the VOC is widely known as the Dutch East India Company. The name Dutch East India Company is used to make a distinction with the British East India Company and other East Indian companies. Other names that have been used include the United East India Company, the United East Indian Company, the United East Indies Company, or the Dutch East Indies Company. Origins. Before the Dutch Revolt, Antwerp had played an important role as a distribution centre in Northern Europe. After 1591, however, the Portuguese used an international syndicate of the German Fuggers and Welsers, and Spanish and Italian firms, that used Hamburg as the northern staple port to distribute their goods, thereby cutting Dutch merchants out of the trade. At the same time, the Portuguese trade system was unable to increase supply to satisfy growing demand. In particular the demand for pepper. Demand for spices was relatively inelastic, and therefore each lag in the supply of pepper caused a sharp rise in pepper prices. In 1580 the Portuguese crown was united in a personal union with the Spanish crown, with which the Dutch Republic was at war. The Portuguese Empire therefore became an appropriate target for Dutch military incursions. These factors motivated Dutch merchants to enter the intercontinental spice trade themselves. Further, a number of Dutchmen like Jan Hein van Linschoten and Cornelis de Houtman obtained first-hand knowledge of the secret Portuguese trade routes and practices, thereby providing opportunity. The stage was thus set for the four-ship exploratory expedition by Frederick de Houtman in 1595 to Banten, the main pepper port of West Java, where they clashed with both the Portuguese and indigenous Indonesians. Houtman's expedition then sailed east along the north coast of Java, losing 12 crew to a Javanese attack at Sidayu and killing a local ruler in Madura. Half the crew were lost before the expedition made it back to the Netherlands the following year, but with enough spices to make a considerable profit. In 1598, an increasing number of fleets was sent out by competing merchant groups from around the Netherlands. Some fleets were lost, but most were successful, with some voyages producing high profits. In March 1599, a fleet of 8 ships under Jacob van Neck was the first Dutch fleet to reach the Spice Islands of Maluku, the source of pepper, cutting out the Javanese middlemen. The ships returned to Europe in 1599 and 1600 and the expedition made a 400% profit. In 1600, the Dutch joined forces with the Muslim Hitues on Ambon Island in an anti-Portuguese alliance, in return for which the Dutch were given the sole right to purchase spices from Hitu. Dutch control of Ambon was achieved when the Portuguese surrendered their fort in Ambon to the Dutch Hitues alliance. In 1613, the Dutch expelled the Portuguese from their Sola fort, but a subsequent Portuguese attack led to a second change of hands. Following this second reoccupation, the Dutch once again captured Sola, in 1636. East of Sola, on the island of Timor, Dutch advances were halted by an autonomous and powerful group of Portuguese Eurasians called the Topasses. They remained in control of the sandalwood trade, and their resistance lasted throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, causing Portuguese Timor to remain under the Portuguese sphere of control. Formative years. At the time, it was customary for a company to be set up only for the duration of a single voyage and to be liquidated upon the return of the fleet. Investment in these expeditions was a very high-risk venture, not only because of the usual dangers of piracy, disease and shipwreck, but also because the interplay of inelastic demand and relatively elastic supply of spices could make prices tumble at just the wrong moment, thereby ruining prospects of profitability. To manage such risk, the forming of a cartel to control supply would seem logical. The English has been the first to adopt this approach. By bundling their resources into a monopoly enterprise, the English East India Company in 1600, thereby threatening their Dutch competitors with ruin. In 1602, the Dutch government followed suit, sponsoring the creation of a single, United East Indies Company, that was also granted monopoly over the Asian trade. With a capital of 6,440,200 guilders, the charter of the new company empowered it to build forts, maintain armies, and conclude treaties with Asian rulers. It provided for a venture that would continue for 21 years, with a financial accounting only at the end of each decade. In February 1603, the company seized the Santa Catarina, a 1,500-ton Portuguese merchant carrack, off the coast of Singapore. She was such a rich prize that her sale proceeds increased the capital of the VOC by more than 50%. Also in 1603, the first permanent Dutch trading post in Indonesia was established in Banten, West Java, and in 1611 another was established at Jayakarta. In 1610, the VOC established the post of Governor-General to more firmly control their affairs in Asia. To advise and control the risk of despotic governors-general, a Council of the Indies was created. The Governor-General effectively became the main administrator of the VOC's activities in Asia, although the Heeren 17, a body of 17 shareholders representing different chambers, continued to officially have overall control. VOC headquarters were located in Ambon during the tenures of the first 3 governors-general, but it was not a satisfactory location. Although it was at the center of the spice production areas, it was far from the Asian trade routes and other VOC areas of activity ranging from Africa to India to Japan. A location in the west of the archipelago was thus sought. The Straits of Malacca were strategic. but had become dangerous following the Portuguese conquest, and the first permanent VOC settlement in Banten was controlled by a powerful local ruler and subject to stiff competition from Chinese and English raiders. In 1604, a second English East India Company voyage commanded by Sir Henry Middleton reached the islands of Ternate, Tidor, Ambon, and Banda. In Banda, they encountered severe VOC hostility, sparking Anglo-Dutch competition for access to spices. From 1611 to 1617, the English established trading posts at Sukadana, Makassar, Jayakarta and Jepara in Java, and Aceh, Pariaman and Jambi in Sumatra, which threatened Dutch ambitions for a monopoly on East Indies trade. Diplomatic agreements in Europe in 1620 ushered in a period of cooperation between the Dutch and the English over the spice trade. This ended with a notorious but disputed incident known as the Amboina Massacre, where 10 Englishmen were arrested, tried and beheaded for conspiracy against the Dutch government. Although this caused outrage in Europe and a diplomatic crisis, the English quietly withdrew from most of their Indonesian activities and focused on other Asian interests. Growth. In 1619, Jan Pius Zoon Koen was appointed Governor-General of the VOC. He saw the possibility of the VOC becoming an Asian power, both political and economic. On the 30th of May 1619, Koen, backed by a force of 19 ships, stormed Jayakarta, driving out the Banten forces, and, from the ashes established Batavia as the VOC headquarters. In the 1620s almost the entire native population of the Banda Islands was driven away, starved to death, or killed in an attempt to replace them with Dutch plantations. These plantations were used to grow cloves and nutmeg for export. Koen hoped to settle large numbers of Dutch colonists in the East Indies, but implementation of this policy never materialized, mainly because very few Dutch were willing to emigrate to Asia. Another of Koen's ventures was more successful. A major problem in the European trade with Asia at the time was that the Europeans could offer few goods that Asian consumers wanted, except silver and gold. European traders therefore had to pay for spices with the precious metals, which were in short supply in Europe, except for Spain and Portugal. The Dutch and English had to obtain it by creating a trade surplus with other European countries. Koen discovered the obvious solution for the problem: to start an intra-Asiatic trade system, whose profits could be used to finance the spice trade with Europe. In the long run this obviated the need for exports of precious metals from Europe, though, at first it required the formation of a large trading capital fund in the Indies. The VOC reinvested a large share of its profits. To this end in the period up to 1630, the VOC traded throughout Asia. Ships coming into Batavia from the Netherlands carried supplies for VOC settlements in Asia. Silver and copper from Japan were used to trade with India and China for silk, cotton, porcelain, and textiles. These products were either traded within Asia for the coveted spices or brought back to Europe. The VOC was also instrumental in introducing European ideas and technology to Asia. The company supported Christian missionaries and traded modern technology with China and Japan. A more peaceful VOC trade post on Dejima, an artificial island off the coast of Nagasaki, was, for more than 200 years, the only place where Europeans were permitted to trade with Japan. When the VOC tried to use military force to make Ming Dynasty China open up to Dutch trade, the Chinese defeated the Dutch in a war over the Penghu Islands from 1623 to 1624, forcing the VOC to abandon Penghu for Taiwan. The Chinese defeated the VOC again at the Battle of Lao Luo Bay in 1633. The Vietnamese Nguyen Lords defeated the VOC in a 1643 battle during the Trinh Nguyen War, blowing up a Dutch ship. The Cambodians defeated the VOC in the Cambodian-Dutch War from 1643 to 1644 on the Mekong River. In 1640, the VOC obtained the port of Gala, Ceylon, from the Portuguese and broke the latter's monopoly of the cinnamon trade. In 1658, Gerard Pius Hult laid siege to Colombo, which was captured with the help of King Rajasinghe II of Kandy. By 1659, the Portuguese had been expelled from the coastal regions, which were then occupied by the VOC, securing for it the monopoly over cinnamon. To prevent the Portuguese or the English from ever recapturing Sri Lanka, the VOC went on to conquer the entire Malabar coast from the Portuguese, almost entirely driving them from the west coast of India. when news of a peace agreement between Portugal and the Netherlands reached Asia in 1663. Goa was the only remaining Portuguese city on the west coast. In 1652, Jan von Riebeeck established an outpost at the Cape of Good Hope to resupply Vok ships on their journey to East Asia. This post later became a full-fledged colony, the Cape Colony, when more Dutch and other Europeans started to settle there. Vok trading posts were also established in Persia, Bengal, Malacca, Siam, Canton, Formosa, as well as the Malabar and Coromandel coasts in India. In 1662, however, Koxinga expelled the Dutch from Taiwan. In 1663, the Vok signed the Painan Treaty, with several local lords in the Painan area that were revolting against the Aceh Sultanate. The treaty allowed the Vok to build a trading post in the area and eventually to monopolize the trade there, especially the gold trade. By 1669, the Vok was the richest private company the world had ever seen, with over 150 merchant ships, 40 warships, 50,000 employees, a private army of 10,000 soldiers, and a dividend payment of 40% on the original investment. Many of the Vok employees intermixed with the indigenous peoples and expanded the population of Indos in pre-colonial history. Reorientation. Around 1670, two events caused the growth of Vok trade to stall. In the first place, the highly profitable trade with Japan started to decline. The loss of the outpost on Formosa to Koxinga in the 1662 siege of Fort Zeelandia and related internal turmoil in China brought an end to the silk trade after 1666. Though the Vok substituted Bengali for Chinese silk, other forces affected the supply of Japanese silver and gold. The shogunate enacted a number of measures to limit the export of these precious metals, in the process limiting Vok opportunities for trade, and severely worsening the terms of trade. Therefore, Japan ceased to function as the linchpin of the intra-Asiatic trade of the Vok by 1685. Even more importantly, the Third Anglo-Dutch War temporarily interrupted Vok trade with Europe. This caused a spike in the price of pepper, which enticed the English East India Company to enter this market aggressively in the years after 1672. Previously, one of the tenets of the Vok pricing policy was to slightly oversupply the pepper market, so as to depress prices below the level where interlopers were encouraged to enter the market. The wisdom of such a policy was illustrated when a fierce price war with the EEC ensued, as that company flooded the market with new supplies from India. In this struggle for market share, the Vok could wait out the EEC. Indeed, by 1683, the latter came close to bankruptcy. Its share price plummeted from 600 to 250, and its president Josiah Child was temporarily forced from office. However, the writing was on the wall. Other companies, like the French East India Company and the Danish East India Company, also started to make inroads on the Dutch system. The Vok therefore closed the heretofore flourishing open pepper emporium of Bantam by a treaty of 1684 with the Sultan. Also, on the Coromandel coast, it moved its chief stronghold from Pulicat to Negapatnam, so as to secure a monopoly on the pepper trade, at the detriment of the French and the Danes. However, the importance of these traditional commodities in the Asian-European trade was diminishing rapidly at the time. The military outlays that the Vok needed to make to enhance its monopoly were not justified by the increased profits of this declining trade. Nevertheless, this lesson was slow to sink in, and at first the Vok made the strategic decision to improve its military position on the Malabar coast by using force to compel the Zamorin of Calicut to submit to Dutch domination. In 1710, the Zamorin was made to sign a treaty with the Vok undertaking to trade exclusively with the Vok and expel other European traders. For a brief time, this appeared to improve the company's prospects. However, in 1715, with EEC encouragement, the Zamorin renounced the treaty. Though a Dutch army managed to suppress this insurrection temporarily, the Zamorin continued to trade with the English and the French, which led to an appreciable upsurge in English and French traffic. The Vok decided in 1721 that it was no longer worth the trouble to try to dominate the Malabar pepper and spice trade. A strategic decision was taken to scale down a Dutch military presence and in effect yield the area to EEC influence. The 1741 Battle of Kalachal, pioneer warriors of Travancore under Raja Marthan de Varma defeated the Dutch. The Dutch commander Captain Eustachius de Launoy was captured. Marthan de Varma agreed to spare the Dutch captain's life on condition that he joined his army and trained his soldiers on modern lines. This defeat in the Travancore Dutch War is considered the earliest example of an organized Asian power overcoming European military technology and tactics. And it signaled the decline of Dutch power in India. The attempt to continue as before as a low-volume, high-profit business enterprise with its core business in the spice trade had therefore failed. The company had however already followed the example of its European competitors in diversifying into other Asian commodities, like tea, coffee, cotton, textiles, and sugar. These commodities provided a lower profit margin and therefore required a larger sales volume to generate the same amount of revenue. This structural change in the commodity composition of the Vox trade started in the early 1680s. After the temporary collapse of the EEC around 1683 offered an excellent opportunity to enter these markets. The actual cause for the change lies, however, in two structural features of this new era. In the first place, there was a revolutionary change in the tastes affecting European demand for Asian textiles, coffee and tea, around the turn of the 18th century. Secondly, a new era of an abundant supply of capital at low interest rates suddenly opened around this time. The second factor enabled the company easily to finance its expansion in the new areas of commerce. Between the 1680s and 1720s, the VOC was therefore able to equip and man an appreciable expansion of its fleet, and acquire a large amount of precious metals to finance the purchase of large amounts of Asian commodities for shipment to Europe. The overall effect was approximately to double the size of the company. The tonnage of the returning ships rose by 125% in this period. However, the company's revenues from the sale of goods landed in Europe rose by only 78%. This reflects the basic change in the Vox circumstances that had occurred. It now operated in new markets for goods with an elastic demand, in which it had to compete on an equal footing with other suppliers. This made for low profit margins. Unfortunately, the business information systems of the time made this difficult to discern for the managers of the company, which may partly explain the mistakes they made from hindsight. This lack of information might have been counteracted by the business acumen of the directors. Unfortunately, by this time these were almost exclusively recruited from the political regent class, which had long since lost its close relationship with merchant circles. Low profit margins in themselves do not explain the deterioration of revenues. To a large extent the costs of the operation of the VOC had a fixed character. Profit levels might therefore have been maintained if the increase in the scale of trading operations that in fact took place had resulted in economies of scale. However, though larger ships transported the growing volume of goods, labor productivity did not go up sufficiently to realize these. In general, the company's overhead rose in step with the growth in trade volume. Decline in gross margins translated directly into a decline in profitability of the invested capital. The era of expansion was one of profitless growth. Specifically, THE long-term average annual profit in the VOX 1630-70 Golden Age was 2.1 million guilders, of which just under half was distributed as dividends and the remainder reinvested. The long-term average annual profit in the expansion age was 2.0 million guilders, of which 3/4 was distributed as dividend and 1/4 reinvested. In the earlier period, profits averaged 18% of total revenues. In the latter period, 10%. The annual return of invested capital in the earlier period stood at approximately 6%. In the latter period, 3.4%. Nevertheless, in the eyes of investors the VOC did not do too badly. The share price hovered consistently around the 400 mark from the mid-1680s, and they reached an all-time high of around 642 in the 1720s. VOC shares then yielded a return of 3.5%, only slightly less than the yield on Dutch government bonds. Decline and fall. After 1730, the fortunes of the VOC started to decline. 5 major problems, not all of equal weight, explain its decline over the next 50 years to 1780. Despite these problems, the VOC in 1780 remained an enormous operation. Its capital in the Republic, consisting of ships and goods in inventory, total 28 million guilders. Its capital in Asia, consisting of the liquid trading fund and goods en route to Europe, totaled 46 million guilders. Total capital, net of outstanding debt, stood at 62 million guilders. The prospects of the company at this time therefore were not hopeless, had one of the plans for reform been undertaken successfully. However, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War intervened. British attacks in Europe and Asia reduced the VOC fleet by half, removed valuable cargo from its control, and devastated its remaining power in Asia. The direct losses of the VOC can be calculated at 43 million guilders. Loans to keep the company operating reduced its net assets to zero. From 1720 on, the market for sugar from Indonesia declined as the competition from cheap sugar from Brazil increased. European markets became saturated. Dozens of Chinese sugar traders went bankrupt, which led to massive unemployment, which in turn led to gangs of unemployed coolies. The Dutch government in Batavia did not adequately respond to these problems. In 1740, rumors of deportation of the gangs from the Batavia area led to widespread rioting. The Dutch military searched houses of Chinese in Batavia for weapons. When a house accidentally burnt down, military and impoverished citizens started slaughtering and pillaging the Chinese community. This massacre of the Chinese was deemed sufficiently serious for the board of the VOC to start an official investigation into the government of the Dutch East Indies for the first time in its history. After the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, the VOC was a financial wreck. After vain attempts at reorganization by the provincial states of Holland and Zeeland, it was nationalized by the new Batavian Republic on 1 March 1796. The VOC charter was renewed several times, but it was allowed to expire on 31 December 1799. Most of the possessions of the former VOC were subsequently occupied by Great Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. But after the new United Kingdom of the Netherlands was created by the Congress of Vienna, some of these were restored to this successor state of the Dutch Republic by the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1814. Organizational structure. The VOC is generally considered to be the world's first truly transnational corporation, and it was also the first multinational enterprise to issue shares of stock to the public. Some historians such as Timothy Brooke and Russell Shorto consider the VOC as the pioneering corporation in the first wave of the corporate globalization era. The VOC was the first multinational corporation to operate officially in different continents such as Europe, Asia, and Africa. While the VOC mainly operated in what later became the Dutch East Indies, the company also had important operations elsewhere. It employed people from different continents and origins in the same functions and working environments. Although it was a Dutch company, its employees included not only people from the Netherlands, but also many from Germany and from other countries as well. Besides the diverse Northwest European workforce recruited by the VOC in the Dutch Republic, the VOC made extensive use of local Asian labor markets. As a result, the personnel of the various VOC offices in Asia consisted of European and Asian employees. Asian or Eurasian workers might be employed as sailors, soldiers, writers, carpenters, smiths, or as simple unskilled workers. At the height of its existence, the VOC had 25,000 employees who worked in Asia and 11,000 who were en route. Also, while most of its shareholders were Dutch, about a quarter of the initial shareholders were Zuid-Nederlanders, and there were also a few dozen Germans. The VOC had two types of shareholders: the participanten, who could be seen as non-managing members, and the 76 bewindhebbers who acted as managing directors. This was the usual setup for Dutch joint stock companies at the time. The innovation in the case of the VOC was that the liability of not just the participanten, but also of the bewindhebbers was limited to the paid-in capital. The VOC therefore was a limited liability company. Also, the capital would be permanent during the lifetime of the company. As a consequence, investors that wished to liquidate their interest in the interim could only do this by selling their share to others on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. Confusion of Confusions, a 1688 dialogue by the Sephardi Jew Joseph de la Vega analyzed the workings of this one stock exchange. The VOC consisted of 6 chambers in port cities: Amsterdam, Delft, Rotterdam, Enkhuizen, Middelburg, and Hoorn. Delegates of these chambers convened as the Heren 17. They were selected from the bewindhebber class of shareholders. Of the Heren 17, 8 delegates were from the Chamber of Amsterdam, 4 from the Chamber of Zeeland, and 1 from each of the smaller chambers, while the 17th seat was alternatively from the Chamber of Middelboord-Zeeland or rotated among the 5 small chambers. Amsterdam had thereby the decisive voice. The Zeelanders in particular had misgivings about this arrangement at the beginning. The fear was not unfounded, because in practice it meant Amsterdam stipulated what happened. The 6 chambers raised the start-up capital of the Dutch East India Company. The raising of capital in Rotterdam did not go so smoothly. A considerable part originated from inhabitants of Dordrecht. Although it did not raise as much capital as Amsterdam or Middelboord-Zeeland, Enkhuizen had the largest input in the share capital of the VOC. Under the first 358 shareholders, there were many small entrepreneurs who dared to take the risk. The minimum investment in the VOC was 3,000 guilders, which priced the company's stock within the means of many merchants. Among the early shareholders of the VOC, immigrants played an important role. Under the 1,143 tenderers were 39 Germans and no fewer than 301 from the southern Netherlands, of whom Isaac Lemaire was the largest subscriber with F85,000. VOC's total capitalization was 10 times that of its British rival. The Heeren 17 met alternately 6 years in Amsterdam and 2 years in Middelboord-Zeeland. They defined the VOC's general policy and divided the tasks among the chambers. The chambers carried out all the necessary work, built their own ships and warehouses and traded the merchandise. The Heeren 17 sent the ship's masters off with extensive instructions on the route to be navigated, prevailing winds, currents, shoals, and landmarks. The VOC also produced its own charts. In the context of the Dutch-Portuguese War, the company established its headquarters in Batavia, Java. Other colonial outposts were also established in the East Indies, such as on the Maluku Islands, which include the Banda Islands, where the VOC forcibly maintained a monopoly over nutmeg and mace. Methods used to maintain the monopoly involved extortion and the violent suppression of the native population, including mass murder. In addition, VOC representatives sometimes used the tactic of burning spice trees to force indigenous populations to grow other crops, thus artificially cutting the supply of spices like nutmeg and cloves. VOC outposts. Organization and leadership structures were varied as necessary in the various VOC outposts. Opperhoofd is a Dutch word, which literally means supreme chief. In this VOC context, the word is a gubernatorial title, comparable to the English chief factor. For the chief executive officer of a Dutch factory in the sense of trading post, as led by a factor, i.e. agent, see more at VOC Opperhoofden in Japan. Shareholder activism at the VOC and the beginnings of modern corporate governance. The 17th century Dutch businessmen, especially the VOC investors, were possibly the history's first recorded investors to consider the corporate governance's problems. Isaac Lemaire, who is known as history's first recorded short seller, was also a sizable shareholder of the VOC. In 1609, he complained of the VOC's shoddy corporate governance. On the 24th of January 1609, Lemaire filed a petition against the VOC, marking the first recorded expression of shareholder activism. In what is the first recorded corporate governance dispute, Lemaire formally charged that the VOC's board of directors sought to retain on others' money for longer or use it ways other than the latter wishes, and petitioned for the liquidation of the VOC in accordance with standard business practice. Initially the largest single shareholder in the VOC and Bewind Hebber sitting on the board of governors, Lemaire apparently attempted to divert the firm's profits to himself by undertaking 14 expeditions under his own accounts instead of those of the company. Since his large shareholdings were not accompanied by great voting power, Lemaire was soon ousted by other governors in 1605 on charges of embezzlement, and was forced to sign an agreement not to compete with the VOC. Having retained stock in the company following this incident, in 1609 Lemaire would become the author of what is celebrated as first recorded expression of shareholder advocacy at a publicly traded company. In 1622, the history's first recorded shareholder revolt also happened among the VOC investors who complained that the company account books had been smeared with bacon, so that they might be eaten by dogs. The investors demanded a rekening, a proper financial audit. The 1622 campaign by the shareholders of the VOC is a testimony of genesis of corporate social responsibility in which shareholders staged protests by distributing pamphlets and complaining about management self-enrichment and secrecy. Historical roles and legacy. With regard to the VOC's importance in global corporate history, Australian journalist Hugh Edwards writes, "The Verenigde Compagnie was the most powerful single commercial concern the world has ever known. General Motors, British Tobacco, Ford, the Shell Company, Mitsubishi, Standard Oil, any of the other giant holdings of today are on the level of village bootmakers compared with the might and power and influence once wielded by the VOC." In his book Amsterdam, A History of the World's Most Liberal City, Russell Shorto summarizes the VOC's greatness. Like the oceans it mastered, the VOC had a scope that is hard to fathom. One could craft a defensible argument that no company in history has had such an impact on the world. Its surviving archives, in Cape Town, Colombo, Chennai, Jakarta, and The Hague, have been measured in kilometers. In innumerable ways the VOC both expanded the world and brought its far-flung regions together. It introduced Europe to Asia and Africa, and vice versa. It pioneered globalization and invented what might be the first modern bureaucracy. It advanced cartography and the shipbuilding. It fostered disease, slavery, and exploitation on a scale never before imaged. The company was arguably the first megacorporation the world has ever seen, possessing quasi-governmental powers, including the ability to wage war, imprison and execute convicts, negotiate treaties, coin money, and establish colonies. Many economic and political historians consider the VOC as the most valuable, powerful, and influential corporation in world history. The VOC existed for almost 200 years from its founding in 1602. When the States General of the Netherlands granted it a 21-year monopoly over Dutch operations in Asia until its demise in 1796. During those 2 centuries, the VOC sent almost 1 million Europeans to work in the Asia trade on 4,785 ships, and netted for their efforts more than 2.5 million tons of Asian trade goods. By contrast, the rest of Europe combined sent only 882,412 people from 1500 to 1795, and the fleet of the English East India Company, the VOC's nearest competitor, was a distant second to its total traffic with 2,690 ships and a mere 1/5 the tonnage of goods carried by the VOC. The VOC enjoyed huge profits from its spice monopoly through most of the 17th century. The company was also considered by many to be the very first major and the most influential corporation in history. The VOC's territories were even larger than some countries. By 1669, the VOC was the richest company the world had ever seen, with over 150 merchant ships, 40 warships, 50,000 employees, a private army of 10,000 soldiers, and a dividend payment of 40% on the original investment. The VOC may have been the biggest company in history with an inflation-adjusted valuation of close to $8 trillion at its peak in 1637. The VOC's 17th-century business model had a massive influence on the evolution of modern corporations in subsequent centuries, including the British East India Company, the VOC's nearest competitor. In many respects, modern-day publicly listed multinational corporations are all the descendants of a business model pioneered by the Dutch East India Company in the 17th century. It was also the VOC-led Dutch financial innovations that helped lay the foundations for the financial system of the modern world, especially in corporate finance, and greatly influenced the financial history of English-speaking countries, especially the United Kingdom and United States.